Hello and welcome to Independence Live. I'm Ian Bruce and this is Rising Clyde, the Scottish Climate Justice Show. In this episode, we're going to be talking about COP27, the next round of the United Nations climate talks, which begin in Egypt in just about 3 weeks' time. And to talk about that, we're very happy to have with us a well-known feminist from Egypt, Fatima Kafahi. She is one of the founders and leaders of the Arab Women's Network, and indeed just last week she helped to organise a whole week of activities on climate justice and women in Jordan. And also from here in Scotland we have Becky Kenton-Lake. She's the coordinator of Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, which of course is a coalition of climate environmental movements here in Scotland that played a very important role in all the mobilisations we saw in Glasgow just a year ago for COP26. Fatima, I want to start finding out a little bit more about what the situation's like in Egypt now, because I think far too many of us know very little about what that situation is like, especially for yourselves, for activists in Egypt, for climate justice activists, women's movement activists, other social movement activists. With just a few weeks to go before COP starts, what is the situation like for you there?
Actually, I mean, there are activists, environmental activists, and also feminist activists. But there were few actually in Egypt. But with the COP27, many people got very much involved, wanted to know what is going to happen with climate change, and they wanted to participate. So there are a lot of them right now. But the sad thing is that there is a divide actually, because the government does not want all the civil society to go to Sharm el-Sheikh. So they prefer, certain small number of sort of governmental NGOs. So they are NGOs, non-governmental organizations, but they belong to the government more. They defend the government. So while in Cairo, there are many activists who know that they will not have a chance to go to Sharm el-Sheikh, but they are trying to do things on their own.
Right, and how does the women's movement fit into that precisely? What activities are you involved in and planning for COP27?
Like we found out, and also women who work with other disadvantaged women, found out that there is very small information or non-information that are reaching many women about the climate change. They don't understand what is happening now, although, there is a rise of temperature and of sea level rise and so on, but they can't really, they don't know much how to do about it. So the information is not really reaching women. What we're trying to do is that it is the right of everyone, and also women, especially the disadvantaged group, to know what is happening. It's not something, for the people who are in science or in environment only to know. So this is one of the things that we want to do. The second thing is that in all what we've read in the government reports and plans, we don't see gender. There is no focus on gender. There's no mention of, because the impact of climate change, it's not the same for everybody. It's not the same for women. It's not also the same for the different groups of the population. So we want actually to have a perspective of women, a perspective of youth in all what is being produced actually for COP27. And we're not only working for COP27. We want to, these issues to be sustained even after COP27.
And just to go back to that first point, you talk about getting that information out to women who are not necessarily involved in the process. How are you doing that? What kind of activities are you putting on to try and spread that word and get that kind of information out?
We are doing this especially with the feminist networks and feminist organizations who work locally, who work with the rural women, who work with refugees, who work with displaced women and so on. So we're trying actually with very simple language to give them, what is going to happen, and also, just tell them it is their right actually to participate with their opinions, and sometimes also they do things on their own, because women are in agriculture very much in Egypt, and they are very much affected actually. So we tell them, but they're not in the decision making at all. So they're not in the irrigation committee, they're not in agriculture cooperatives, so their voice is not heard. So we are trying to actually also talk to people who are in control, that you have also to get women involved. So that's the most important thing in Egypt and in other Arab countries, is that the information is not really reaching people. And
Yeah.
I mean, there are, like, some information, but very, very complicated scientific, that is not really understood by by people, especially we have high illiteracy rate and so on.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back and talk a little bit more about those, about how those movements are developing. But Becky, if I could come at it from the other angle, last year, last November, 11 months ago, just over, we saw really surprisingly big and strong mobilizations here in Glasgow. So, what do you think were the takeaways from that? How much? What? Looking back at it now, how much did we achieve? How much did we not achieve? And what are we looking to achieve now at COP27?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I'll start with the positives, although there were probably a lot more negatives, unfortunately. But I mean, I think one of the positives is how the climate movement came together in Scotland, and we hosted people from all over the world who came to COP26. We put on a huge amount of kind of fringe events to kind of promote different messages around climate justice. And I think people in Scotland can be really proud of the way that they opened their doors and everything to kind of civil society from all over the world. And I think that made a huge difference to COP26 to kind of show how much support there was for strong action. So that's definitely one of the positives. Kind of inside the talks, the kind of headlines were really that countries just didn't kind of commit enough the promises weren't enough to kind of slow emissions to 1.5 degrees. So their countries had to bring these commitments called nationally determined contributions, and that's the commitment they make to how much they're going to cut emissions. And when you kind of added all these up, I think some of the estimates that it puts us on course for kind of over 2 degrees of warming, which is obviously absolutely devastating for much of the world. So that was a real disadvantage and a real kind of disappointment from COP26. And the result of that is that countries have to bring new commitments to COP27 in Egypt this year, and so they have to update those nationally determined contributions. So we really need to see those strengthened this year. The other side,
and if I can just jump in there, to be honest, it's not looking very positive, is it? Because I think so far we've got quite a small number of countries that have presented any kind of new NDCs, these new commitments to cut emissions. Nothing like what would be needed to redress the already inadequate promises that we saw last year.
Yeah, absolutely. And the UK government is obviously kind of the outgoing president of COP26. It'll pass the baton over to Egypt in next month. And the UK's NDC is already kind of looking pretty inadequate, and it hasn't really built on much from last year. So that's really disappointing, because obviously the presidency kind of sets an example to the other nations. So that's really disappointing. But the other side of the coin to that emissions reduction is around climate finance. So as well as reducing emissions, kind of rich developed nations have a real duty to deliver finance to the countries that are most impacted by the climate crisis and who've also done least to cause it. So back in at COP15 in Copenhagen, there was a commitment for rich countries to deliver 100 billion in climate finance. That's for kind of mitigation and adaptation from climate change. And that figure was kind of plucked out of the air, and it's already kind of quite inadequate, but it's also not been delivered on. It was supposed to be delivered by 2020, and the rich countries have failed to deliver that money. There's a chance that they might deliver it by 2023, I think, but it's still kind of inadequate and very, very late. So there's really real disappointment on that side as well, on the climate finance side. And kind of related to that is kind of finance for losses and damages. So this is the kind of climate impacts that are kind of irreversible, like people losing their livelihoods, their lives, their cultures, and the kind of rich countries needing to pay compensation and money to kind of help them recover from that. And that was also kind of not on the official agenda, which is a real disappointment to lots of countries that have been calling for that for many years.
Right, and that's separate from the, the 100 billion, I'm sorry, which never turned up anyway, was meant to be to help people to adapt for the future effects of climate change. And what we're talking about here is loss and damage, which is actually helping people to deal with the changes they've already suffered from droughts and so on and so forth. I think that's a good moment to come back to you, Fatima, because just give us an idea of what these last 12 months have meant in terms of the climate crisis in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, because we've from the little information, inadequate information we receive here, it's clear that it's been a very, very difficult situation for many of the countries in that region, right?
Actually, there was not so much concern, not even from the Arab governments, to participate in so many, COPs before. But because, this year it's going to be in Egypt, next year it's going to be in the United Arab Emirates. So the whole region, especially the civil society, started addressing this, which is very good because, there isn't much of governments trying to actually to get the views of the normal people, but they are pushing very much. No, we also have a say because we are the ones who are going to be, suffering more than anybody else. Now really so many networks and different networks, people who are involved, like teachers, professors of environment, are making, networks, discussing the whole issue about it. Regionally also we come together with Africa also because, Egypt is in North Africa as well as other Arab countries. So we link actually closely because we have more or less the same problems, facing the same crisis. Like, for instance, agriculture. So many African countries, the Arab region depends very much on agriculture that is being affected and is going to be affected more. And women, 60% of the labor force in agriculture, they are women. And women who are really cultivating the land, taking care of the irrigation, but they don't own the land. In the whole Arab region, only 10% of the land is owned by women. And this means that they really lack, the resources, and also they lack the power of making decisions. So this is very much annoying. But the good thing, they started actually looking at the structural gender gap in that, because women do not own because of the inheritance system we've got. So it's like, really, the climate change has magnified the problems that women face and the gender gap that the whole women in the Arab region face. So now they are addressing the structural things because this is what makes them actually suffer more and more. So also they don't have access to good health services. So and climate change is really going also to affect, pregnant women, children, and so on. The scarcity of food actually it has a burden on women because women take care of the care economy. They are, responsible for getting food for the whole family and so on. With the climate change and also with the, countries like Egypt import a lot of food from outside. And now, we don't have because of also of Ukraine-Russian war and all this. So there is so much suffering from lack of necessary food. We have to really look into also gender disaggregated data because there is also a rise in malnutrition among children. We can't right now say related to the climate change right now, but it is apt actually to be linked very much with the climate change. So
can I just interrupt there a minute, because you mentioned two really important things there, which is the food crisis, which is obviously partly a consequence of climate change, but also of as you say, the war in Ukraine and so forth. and the drought, which obviously is, closely linked to that. How does that specifically impact on women? I mean, what's the specific, way that women experience that in Egypt, and in Sudan and Somalia and so forth, the countries of the Horn of Africa?
Yes, because women are mostly, left alone, for instance, in the agriculture areas to take care of the land and the cultivation, and men prefer to find jobs in urban areas. So they leave behind women there, and women have to, they are the responsible, because the so traditional norms and culture and so on that put on the women the burden of really providing for the family, especially, trying to get the food for the children and so on. So with the scarcity of food, it really, it is a burden on her. Besides, she does not know, or she does not have the power to change the mix of crops of agriculture. She has the power, no power actually on decisions of irrigation that must be adopted because of climate change. So she finds herself in Egypt and in other Arab countries like in Sudan and so on. So there is a problem of how to really manage all this. If nobody is reaching her with simple technology, or giving her the chance of taking decisions of how to really adapt in terms of agricultural mix, crop mix, of irrigation, of using new sort of organic fertilizers and all these details. She does not have access to it, and at the same time she has to provide for the family as well, because also men migrate. And another thing that the whole Arab countries also suffer from is the armed conflict. We have armed conflict in Libya, in Yemen, in now in Iraq, in so many Arab countries. And usually this also is a burden, because there are so many displaced women actually because of the armed conflict, that they have also to move from the places they are in to other places, and they face also violence because there are tension among, with very small resources. There are tension among, different groups like ethnic groups and so on, and usually it's taken, out on women in terms of violence, and trying to make her immobile, also no mobility, trying also to push her away from having also to be, taking some of the resources for herself and her family as well.
Becky, let me come back to you again on this, because clearly, in the face of those really, really difficult and distressing conditions that a lot of people have to deal with in the Arab countries and in North Africa, I want to come back to what those of us, climate activists and the wider civil society in the North, should be doing, should be thinking about. And maybe we could start with that point, because the Scottish government took a little bit of initiative. They themselves say it was a small initiative to try and get the ball rolling on this loss and damage finance. They took that at Glasgow, and they've been trying to build on that. Tell us a little bit about what it is that the Scottish government's been trying to do, and what do you make of that? Is it really going to go anywhere?
Yeah, so the Scottish Government at COP26, they were the first country to announce funding for climate loss and damage, which was obviously very welcome, and it was a kind of quite a symbolic gesture to kind of be the first country. And what we are hoping is that it kind of sets an example and kind of shows leadership on this issue ahead of COP27, and kind of encourages other rich nations to do the same. Because, like the Scottish Government themselves have admitted, it's £2 million, which is kind of nowhere near our true kind of the true amount that we owe because of our kind of the climate damages that we've caused. So we're really keen that other countries kind of follow Scotland's example, but also commit more like their fair share of the finance that countries are due. Loss and damage is on the official COP27 agenda this year, so there's a bit more hope, but I think there's still a lot of doubt that we'll actually end COP27 with a proper commitment to loss and damage finance. So I think the best thing that people in Scotland can do is kind of continue to kind of talk about this issue and talk about it to your MPs and MSPs. And we're going to try and keep it a real live issue in Scotland, and try and kind of encourage the Scottish government to use that example to encourage others to do the same.
More widely than just the Scottish government's initiative, I mean, there's been a bit of talk about reparations, haven't there? Climate reparations in the movement. Can you explain exactly what's meant by that? Is that the same as climate finance and climate, loss and damage, or are we talking about something different there?
I think it's really a way of kind of seeing it. It's like a principle behind it, really. It should be kind of embedded in kind of thinking on climate finance, really, rather than it being a separate thing. So, I mean, as Nicola Sturgeon said herself at COP26, like the loss and damage finance, it's an act of reparation rather than charity. So this money needs to be properly commensurate with the kind of damages that we've caused. And it also needs to not be seen as something like humanitarian assistance or aid. It is a separate thing. It's reparations for the damage. So I think it is a bit of a shift in mindset to kind of normal kind of finance that we talk about.
Yeah, I think one point, oh, sorry, Fatima, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Becky actually, because women in our region are complaining about, the loss and damage is based on a quantitative, thing, and they're not really looking like women do a lot and they don't get paid. I mean, all the unpaid work and all the care economy they are doing, they are not counted actually. So they are not on the winning side of any loss and damage negotiation, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of campaigning around COPs, around the need to kind of take into account the needs of the youth and needs of women in all of these conversations. And there's a lot of people kind of campaigning on that. And I think there's lots of kind of thinking around climate reparations is it should definitely kind of go beyond finance. Like we're kind of compensating for things and it's not shouldn't just be done financially. There should be other mechanisms as well. So it does go beyond.
Can you give me an idea? What kind of things are you thinking of?
I think kind of sharing of resources, like other non-financial kind of resources, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that thinking is kind of still at an early stage. But I think we need to be thinking beyond just kind of the transfer of straight finance.
Yeah, I mean, Fatima, you talked a little bit about how different organisations and movements coming together around the Arab world and in Africa. Do you have like a common agenda, a common set of demands or objectives that you want to present, either to actually get answers from COP27 or at least to make your demands better known at COP27?
Well, actually, we did a study. I mean, enumerating, at a regional level, what are the networks that really active. And I mean, there's so many of them, but unfortunately, they're still working in silos. They're not coming together. Then at the governmental level, it's the League of Arab States that is really organizing or trying to organize Arab governments to take one stand in COP27 and COP28. But they are not really also listening to civil society as much as they can. So, but I mean, because for the feminist organization in the Arab region, I can say that we're coming together because in Amman, Jordan, last week, we had like 45 feminist organizations from like 13 Arab countries. And we had a statement at the end really that summarized our demands, our urgent ones and our, sort of longer term ones. And we also, I mean, for instance, I think there is, a request for parity. This is an international request for gender parity in the delegations that, go to COP27 or any of the conferences. I mean, we are very, very far from it. I mean, I know, a small number of countries have really reached parity, but in the Arab region, I mean, it's all governmental thing, and with very few, maybe they choose one of the youth and one of women to participate. So where are women and youth in your delegation? So that's our question. And also, we're not saying, any women, but women who really have expertise. And also, why aren't you telling our delegation something, about gender, so that they go also with the gender justice perspective when they go and negotiate? Because I'm sure they don't. We also criticize actually UN because of all this accreditation for NGOs to participate in the COP is very complicated. I mean, it closes like 1 year before. The application is very complicated to fill actually. So this is also, I mean, they really should, the UN also facilitate the participation of the civil society. So these are, the short run requests that we are asking for, but we're asking for so many, other things, because we are saying like, um, the absence of a gender perspective in all, most of the Arab countries' plans, it is completely absent. So, I mean, they
I mean,
cannot.
will there actually be any protests in Sharm el Sheikh or elsewhere in Egypt during COP27?
I mean, by law, demonstrations are forbidden in Egypt for quite some years now. What we heard is that the government is assigning like a building for those who want to demonstrate. But a demonstration should be, I mean, heard, should be seen by everybody, and should not be, in a small building, where nobody is hearing uh, so also the security situation is not very good, especially for Egyptians and the Arabs. I mean, so there are lots of also precautions being taken, in case of anything goes wrong for any of the attendees of the civil society. But there are lots of I mean, statements about also the situation of human rights, and campaigns for youth who have been imprisoned for many years for no charges whatsoever. So the issue of human rights has been very, very much addressed also, mostly inside and outside Egypt.
Given that, I mean, we're coming almost to the end of our time, but I'd just like to get a feeling of how you both think about the next steps, if you like, because, Becky pointed out earlier that, in spite of the quite big mobilizations we managed to have in Scotland last year, most people were very disappointed by the outcomes of COP26. They fell way short in terms of emissions cuts, in terms of finance, in terms of all those things you mentioned. Can we really expect any kind of progress at all at COP27? And if we're not going to get any serious progress, what should we be doing? I mean, whether that's in Egypt and the Arab world or here in Scotland. I'd like to maybe some final thoughts on that, each of you. Becky, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the most important things people in Scotland and around the world can do to kind of show solidarity with people in Egypt and Africa. This COP is, I mean, activists in Egypt have called a global day of action on the 12th of November, and so there's going to be a big march in Edinburgh on that day, and all places all across the UK as well. So just really encourage people to look out for that and come along if they can. And I think the opportunity we have this year is to kind of link up with all the different crises we're facing. So we've got the cost of living crisis, the nature crisis, we've got the unions who are striking, and I think there's just an opportunity for us all to come together and kind of call for action on all these crises, and it's an opportunity for us all to come together again a year on from COP26.
Fatima, maybe just a final word on what you hope to come out of all this, and what you think you can do and we should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, as Becky has said, actually, solidarity is very important. We want to link, with the countries who has, stronger voice than our voice. We want our voice to be reached. So we want to give you the statements, and we want you to talk about it. We want to distribute it. But the good thing is that, it's difficult actually to shut up us, because we say, no, we want to talk about climate change as much as you want to, and you cannot deprive us from this. Under climate change, there's so many things. The economic situation, the human rights situation, and so on. But the umbrella is giving us a space, actually, to have our voice heard. Maybe it's not going to be very influential now, but we're keeping on. We're not stopping. So that's what we're hoping for.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's an example for all of us, and I think that will, hopefully inspire people here to support that as much as possible. Thank you so much. We've been talking about COP27, the prospects for that, and more importantly, the prospects for the movement for climate justice around COP27. We've been talking to Fatima Kafahi, a feminist in Egypt, a leader of the Arab Women's Network, and Becky Kenton-Lake from Stop Climate Chaos Scotland. Thank you so much, and until the next time, goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.